For almost all of human history, this was it. Fire. A candle. A flame you had to protect with your own hands. Because if it went out, so did your night. Then, one October evening in 1879, in a quiet laboratory in New Jersey, a man sat alone and watched a small glass bulb glow. Not for a second, not for a minute, but for over 13 straight hours. He didn't cheer. He didn't call anyone in. He just sat there, watching it burn. That man had already failed more times than most people fail in a lifetime. Some accounts say he tried over 1,000 different materials before that filament finally held. And when a reporter later asked him about all those failures, he reportedly gave an answer that would outlive him by more than a century. That he hadn't failed. He'd simply found 1,000 ways that didn't work. This is the story of Thomas Edison. Not the polished version they teach you in school. The real one. The obsessive, ruthless, brilliant, and deeply flawed man who didn't just invent the light bulb. He invented the idea of the modern inventor. And along the way, he'd crush a rival, build an empire, and leave behind a legacy far messier than the myth. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why some historians call him a genius, and others call him one of the most controversial figures in American history. Thomas Alva Edison was born in 1847 in the small town of Milan, Ohio, the youngest of 7 children. As a boy, he was restless, endlessly curious, and, by most accounts, a nightmare for his teachers. He only spent a few months in formal schooling. One story, repeated for generations, claims a teacher called him addled or slow. Historians now debate how much of that story is true and how much was polished later by Edison himself. But what we do know for certain is this. His mother, a former schoolteacher, pulled him out and taught him at home. And that decision may have changed the course of technological history. Because at home, young Edison wasn't held back by a curriculum. He read everything he could get his hands on. He built a chemistry lab in the basement. He was, by all accounts, obsessed with how things worked, and even more obsessed with making them work better. By 12, he was already earning his own money, selling newspapers and candy on trains. And it was on those very trains that he'd set up a tiny science lab in a spare boxcar, until an experiment caused a small fire and got him kicked off. Undeterred, the teenage Edison learned telegraphy, the internet of the 1860s, and began traveling from city to city as a telegraph operator, tinkering with the machines every chance he got. He wasn't content to just use technology. He wanted to rebuild it. By his early 20s, he'd made his way to New York with barely $1 to his name. Within a few short years, he wouldn't just be an inventor. He'd be running one of the most feared laboratories in the world. In 1876, Edison did something almost nobody had done before. He built a place whose entire purpose was to invent things on command, on a schedule, like a factory. He called it Menlo Park. Picture this, a sprawling compound in rural New Jersey, filled with chemicals, machine tools, and dozens of hired scientists and engineers working around the clock. Edison promised the press a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. It sounded almost absurd. And yet, somehow, he mostly delivered. This is where Edison earned the nickname that would follow him forever, the Wizard of Menlo Park. His first massive hit came in 1877, the phonograph, a machine that could actually record sound and play it back. To the public, this wasn't just impressive. It felt like magic. Newspapers wrote that Edison had done something no human being had ever managed. He had captured a human voice and made it repeat itself, on command, forever. But the phonograph was just the warm-up. Edison had his sights set on something far bigger, something that could change how every single human being on Earth lived their lives after the sun went down. Electric light already existed in a crude form, arc lighting, blindingly bright and impractical for homes. Edison's obsession wasn't inventing light. It was making it practical, safe, affordable, something you could have glowing softly in your living room. And that obsession would consume years of his life and the lives of the people working for him. Here's what the textbooks don't always tell you. Edison didn't invent the light bulb out of nowhere. Other inventors around the world had already been experimenting with similar ideas for decades. What Edison did, and this is the part that actually made him a legend, was solve the problem nobody else could crack, finding a filament that could glow for hours without burning out, using a system that could be practically and affordably wired into homes. His team tested material after material. Platinum, various metals, different types of thread, reportedly even considered materials as unusual as bits of hair. Failure after failure after failure. Most people would have quit after the 100th attempt. Edison kept going past the 1,000th. When it finally worked, a carbonized cotton thread filament, glowing steadily for over 13 hours in that October 1879 test, it wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration. It was the last brick in a wall built one failure at a time. But here's the detail most people miss. Inventing the bulb was the easy part compared to what came next. A light bulb is useless without a way to deliver electricity to it. So Edison didn't just have to invent a product. He had to invent an entire system, power plants, wiring, meters, the whole infrastructure of electricity delivery, essentially from scratch. In 1882, his Pearl Street power station lit up a section of Lower Manhattan, and for the first time in human history, part of a city ran on electric light delivered from a central power source. The age of the flame was ending. The age of the wire had begun. Now here's where the story turns darker. Edison's electrical system ran on something called direct current, or DC. It worked, but it had a serious weakness. It couldn't travel very far without losing power, meaning you needed power stations scattered everywhere. A rival inventor, a brilliant and eccentric former Edison employee named Nikola Tesla, believed a different system, alternating current, or AC, was the future. AC could travel much farther, much more efficiently. And an industrialist named George Westinghouse backed Tesla's system, setting up a direct commercial threat to Edison's entire empire. What followed became known as the War of the Currents, and it's one of the ugliest chapters of Edison's legacy. To protect his DC investment, Edison's camp launched a public campaign to convince Americans that AC was dangerous. This included public demonstrations electrocuting animals, and, most disturbingly, involvement in the development of the electric chair, using AC current, specifically to associate Tesla and Westinghouse's technology with death in the public's mind. It was brilliant marketing. It was also, by almost any modern standard, deeply unethical. And in the end, it didn't even work. AC was simply more efficient. Westinghouse and Tesla's system won out, and it's the foundation of the power grid the entire world still uses today. It's a crucial reminder. Edison wasn't purely a scientist chasing curiosity. He was also a businessman, sometimes a ruthless one, fighting to protect an empire. By the time he was in his 40s, Edison held hundreds of patents and had built what would eventually become General Electric, one of the largest companies on Earth. But behind the legend was a complicated man, one who was a distant husband and father, often consumed entirely by work. He reportedly worked such relentless hours that sleep became almost optional to him, catching short naps on lab benches rather than in his own bed. He also wasn't always the sole genius the myth suggests. Menlo Park succeeded because of teams of engineers and scientists working under his direction, talented people whose individual contributions were often folded into Edison's name and patents. That's not necessarily unusual for the era, but it's part of why modern historians view him with more nuance than the simple lone genius story. Still, nuance aside, his sheer output is almost impossible to overstate. By the end of his life, Edison held over 1,000 U.S. patents. Motion picture cameras, improved telegraph systems, batteries, innovations that touched nearly every corner of modern life. Thomas Edison died in October of 1931 at the age of 84. There's a story, often repeated, impossible to fully verify, but too fitting not to mention, that as news of his failing health spread, some suggested a tribute. For one moment, turn the lights off across the country, in honor of the man who gave them light in the first place. Whether or not that moment happened exactly as legend describes, the symbolism stuck. Because by the time Edison died, electric light wasn't a novelty anymore. It was simply life. Millions of people flipping a switch every single night, never once thinking about the 1,000 failures it took to make that moment possible. So was Thomas Edison a genius? A ruthless businessman? A visionary? A flawed man who let ambition cross ethical lines? The honest answer is, he was all of it at once. And maybe that's the real lesson history keeps trying to teach us, that the people who change the world are almost never simple heroes. They're complicated, relentless, sometimes brilliant, sometimes wrong. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe for more real history. No myths, no shortcuts, just the full story.